All right, we're going to dive into a really critical and honestly an often overlooked problem in global business. It's all about how a single legal phrase can turn a multi-million-dollar win into, well, a totally worthless piece of paper. This is the loophole that gets you after you think you've already won the fight.
So imagine this. Your company just went through a huge, complex international deal. You did everything by the book. But, things happen. A dispute comes up. You go through the whole legal process. Maybe it's arbitration, maybe mediation. And guess what? You win. So you've got this legal award, this judgment in your hand. But there's a problem. The other party's assets, they're all in another country. And you suddenly realize winning the case? That was the easy part. The real battle is just about to start.
And that brings us right to our first major topic, this whole cross-border problem. It's a fundamental headache in international law that makes getting what you're owed an absolute nightmare.
I mean, think about it, right? Why should a court in, say, France automatically care about a ruling from a court in Japan? There's no world government, no global police to make them. Your hard-won legal victory doesn't just magically hop across borders. Now, to solve this exact problem, the international community came up with a kind of solution. Think of it as a global handshake. Let's take a look at the two huge agreements that basically created this system. Okay, so the system is built on two key pillars. You've got arbitration and mediation. They're different processes, so they need different rules. For those binding decisions made by an arbitrator, we've got the super important New York Convention. And for the newer world of settlements reached with a mediator, there's the Singapore Convention. So two different paths, but they're both aiming for the exact same goal, making your win here enforceable over there. So the whole point of these conventions is for them to act like a passport for your legal win. You show up in a foreign court, you present your award or settlement, and that court is supposed to just stamp it, recognize it, and help you get your money. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, yeah, not so fast. Because hidden inside these really powerful global treaties is one small, vague, but incredibly powerful phrase that can bring the whole process to a grinding halt. The entire point of all this was to make enforcement quick and predictable. You hand over your award, and unless there was some crazy procedural mess up, it should get enforced. Almost automatic. But you know how it is with the law. The devil is always in the details. So what is the escape hatch? What's the one excuse a country can use to back out of this global handshake? This is it, the public policy exception. It's the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. A country can say, nope, not enforcing this if the award violates its public policy. Now, the most important part here is what's missing. The conventions never, ever tell us what public policy actually is. They just leave it completely up to each country to figure out for itself. And that ambiguity creates a wild spectrum of different approaches. So let's look at how two different countries take this exact same phrase and come up with totally different results for businesses on the ground. So you can basically split the world into two camps here. On one side, you've got countries that take a very narrow, very restrictive view. And on the other, you have countries that go for a much, much broader interpretation. So let's start with Singapore, which is a huge global hub for this stuff. Their courts have set the bar incredibly high. For them to refuse an award based on public policy, that award has to be so bad that it literally shocks the conscience. We're not talking about small legal disagreements. We're talking about things that violate the most basic ideas of right and wrong. This approach gives you a ton of predictability.
Okay, now let's flip over and look at Vietnam. At first glance, their definition sounds pretty reasonable. Public policy is just the fundamental principles of Vietnamese law. But what on earth does that mean in the real world?
Well, it means the door is just blown wide open. A Vietnamese court could decide, you know what, we're just going to rehear the whole case, basically throwing out the original arbitrator's decision. They might decide that a conflict with any local law, no matter how tiny, violates a fundamental principle. For any business trying to operate there, this creates a huge amount of risk and uncertainty. And this example just says it all. In one case, a Vietnamese court refused to enforce an award because it decided the arbitration agreement itself didn't follow Vietnamese law. And this was even though the agreement was perfectly fine under the international law the two parties had specifically chosen for their contract. The local rule just steamrolled the global standard. So let's just lay this out side by side. It makes it crystal clear. You've got Singapore with its narrow approach, which creates a stable, predictable world for business. And then you have Vietnam's broad approach, which basically creates a legal minefield. For any international company, your choice of where to do business, or even where you set up your arbitration, could mean the difference between getting paid and being dragged back into court all over again.
So why should you care about what seems like a tiny bit of legal jargon? Well, because it has massive, real-world consequences.
Seriously, this is not just some academic debate for lawyers. How a country interprets public policy is a giant economic signal. It's like a flashing sign telling investors, banks, and companies all over the world exactly how reliable its legal system is and whether their contracts will actually be honored.
So let's just follow the money here. A narrow approach like Singapore's is like a magnet for investment because it screams reliability. But a broad approach like Vietnam's creates risk, and that can scare money away. At the end of the day, this one little phrase really highlights the fundamental tension of our global economy. It's this constant tug of war between global rules and a nation's right to do its own thing.
And that's the big question I want to leave you with. In a world where business is constantly crossing borders, who gets the final say? Should that global handshake, the international agreement, always win? Or should a country always have the right to say not on my turf based on its own local laws? The answer to that has huge implications for the future of how we all do business.